All right, thank you so much. Thanks for that great intro. It's great to see everyone here today. And I'm especially excited to talk to educators because I think that we actually share a lot of the same goals and kind of sensibilities around making economics the best topic in the world come alive to an audience that doesn't may not know yet that they are super into economics, or maybe they don't know how to get started with economics. They're not sure how to approach it, and it's our job to make it accessible and friendly and to kind of get across the impact of the topic. So I think there's a lot we can learn from each other, and I'm here today to talk about what's inside, what goes into an indicator episode. So I'm calling this talk Inside the Indicator. And along the way, I'll also talk a little bit about Planet Money and the Planet Money book, which I think everyone here is getting a copy of. So for those of you who don't know, Planet Money is NPR's kind of OG flagship economics podcast. It came out of the Great Recession as actually a This American Life episode to explain what was going on with the subprime crisis. Then it became its own show. And then some years later, The Indicator was spun off as a daily show. So the OG show comes out twice a week. Their episodes are a little longer, around 20 plus minutes. We come out 5 days a week, every weekday, and our episodes are 10 minutes or less. But we try to do the same thing, which is take narrative storytelling techniques and use them to kind of elucidate what's going on in the world of economics. And so today I'm going to share with you three principles, kind of three guiding principles that we use on the show. And the first one is we like to find the economic system or principle at work behind the headlines. So several times a week, the team will get together. We will discuss what's in the news, what's relevant to us, what looks interesting. And for every news story, I mean, obviously, economics has been in the news so much. It's almost overwhelming, the fire hose of economic news there is, especially in the last year or so between tariffs and immigration policy and, everything in between. And so there's certainly no shortage of news stories, breaking news stories we could jump on, but we try to take a slightly different tack where we're on the news, but we're not covering breaking news. We're not pushing like a million alerts to your phone. NPR has, like other divisions that do that. What we try to do is say, okay, there's this thing happening in the news that relates to economics in some way. And is there something that's being maybe not covered as much or not covered at all? Is there an economic system working behind the scenes or some kind of economic concept that we could explain for our listeners to say like, hey, let's bring you one level of understanding deeper on something that you're seeing in the news. And so I have a couple examples. The first one is going to be from Planet Money, the flagship show, and there's a section in your book, in the Planet Money book, about it, and it's about Bobby Bonilla Day, which, for those of you who don't know, Bobby Bonilla was a player in the Mets, and I think it was back in 2020 or so. They were going to release him from his contract, and they owed him $6 million on his contract. And they worked out a deal with him, a deal that will go down in infamy, where they said, instead of giving you the $6 million now, can we wait a decade? And then starting in a decade's time, you will receive $1.2 million every year until the year, I think it was like 2035, 2037, something like that. And so this deal ended up, well, by the time it's done, because we're still kind of in the middle of it, it will have paid Bobby Bonilla $30 million instead of $6 million. So if you're a Mets fan or just a baseball fan, this deal is infamous because it's like, how did the Mets sign this deal? And so Planet Money did an episode about it. Again, it also got adapted in a chapter in the book. And they use Bobby Bonilla Day because July 1st is when he gets the check. So that's Bobby Bonilla Day. They use Bobby Bonilla Day as a way to explain compound interest, which is like such a fundamental concept in finance and economics. And this is a clip from the episode hosted by Kenny Malone and James Sneed.
Bobby Bonilla Day is a kind of real holiday about finance and money and is a celebration of the Mets making a terrible mistake and signing a terrible contract.
Celebration. If you're a Mets fan, Bobby Bo Day is more of a day of mourning.
But if you are Planet Money, the story of this baseball contract contains the single most important financial lesson that we can teach you.
It's a lesson that will help you if you're buying a car, if you're paying off loans, or if you're just saving for retirement.
Yeah, there is something for everybody. in Bobby Bonilla Day.
Oof, it's a day I'd like to forget about.
What you talking about?
Bobby Bonilla Day.
Bobby Bonilla Day. Oh, man. Isn't that coming up?
It's coming up.
Oh,
that's why
brother.
he's got the microphone
Yes,
there.
yes.
All right, so that's just like a fun example that, kind of walks you into the concept of compound interest. But you hear from these Mets fans, like they actually went to the stadium and just kind of approached Mets fans, and they're like, "What do you think about Bobby Bonilla Day?" And these like two guys you hear from, they seem like they're straight out of central casting, like they're reading lines or something. But actually, these are honest to God Mets fans that Kenny and James found. So that's one example. The second example of how we try to illustrate an economic system at work is an episode that I reported a couple years ago. If you remember the massive baby formula shortage that happened nationwide, there was a problem with a powder formula made by Abbott Labs at a plant in Michigan, and it led to widespread shortages of formula. And what we discovered as we reported out this piece is that many of you probably know about this food assistance program that is a national program, but it's administered at the state level called WIC, Women, Infant, and Children. And nutrition support and formula is a huge part of this program. And so if you are a WIC recipient, you are given money to purchase formula for your infant. And what we explained in the episode is that way back in the 80s, the cost of infant formula was rising faster than the cost of inflation. And so this was eating up a huge chunk of states' budgets for the WIC program. And so they asked the manufacturers of formula if they could get some kind of discount. Like, can we cut a deal where we're not paying as much for formula because it's so expensive? And the manufacturers said, yes, happy to make a deal with you. In return for us giving you a discount on formula, we want to have sole source contracts. So, in other words, if we get the contract for WIC in your state, we want to be the only supplier for formula. So, it was a way for states to kind of lock up a lot of market share. And eventually, this whole system developed where it turns out that just a very small amount of manufacturers like Abbott came to dominate the baby formula market. And so here's a kind of how that played out.
And once a company won that exclusive WIC contract for a state, it was all but guaranteed total market dominance in that state, thanks to what researchers describe as a kind of spillover effect.
So here's what would happen. Because WIC is such a large program, grocery stores would dedicate the most shelf space to whichever formula brand had that sole source contract. And then non-WIC shoppers would end up buying that brand too, because that was all they saw when they went to the supermarket. So thanks to this spillover effect, the WIC system of awarding sole source contracts ended up creating a winner-takes-all market for formula in each state.
Right, so that was just the way that's like an excerpt from the episode where we explained the system, like a system that has been humming along behind the scenes, since the 80s basically, or the 90s, that, unless you are a WIC administrator in a state or you work for one of these manufacturers, you were probably not aware it even existed. Even as a WIC customer, you would simply go to the store and know that you're allowed to spend your WIC dollars on this specific kind of formula. So this is what we try to do. To me, this is kind of like a canonical example of like when everything comes together, where it's like, wow, there is this entire system that involves like a competitive bidding process and like a government program, social services, and kind of this like these interesting market dynamics that then all kind of come to a head with this baby formula shortage. Because the system, as we saw, it worked great until it didn't, right? Until one manufacturer was kind of taken offline, and then you had kind of like a massive health crisis for a lot of parents in the country. So those are two examples of us trying to find an economic system or principle at work behind the headlines. The second principle I'm going to talk about is make it personal. And I think there's a lot about economics that can feel very abstract, like it doesn't relate to people's day-to-day lives, even though we know as educators that it has everything to do with people's day-to-day lives. And often, it can be hard to make this stuff come alive and feel real, and for people who are not kind of deep in the weeds like we are all day long. So we find we work really hard to make economics personal, and that often means finding someone who can be the face of like an economic concept or story or something that's happening. So the first example is pretty recent. This is just from last month. We covered the SpaceX IPO, And we wanted to find someone whose life would be changed by having all this money from the IPO, a SpaceX employee. And I really like this episode because there's like so many kind of tech bros we could have probably found who could have told us about how options made them rich. But my coworker Darian, who is the lead reporter on this, actually found someone from a blue collar background without a college degree who had worked in a plant, a SpaceX plant, as a scheduler and actually had gotten laid off from SpaceX, but still had a bunch of options. And he was able to tell us what this money meant to him.
He says those shares he and his wife bought for $50,000 or $60,000 are now worth a lot more. He wouldn't say the exact amount, and if you've been following the markets, you'll know SpaceX stock has been erratic to say the least. But he says it's between $1 and $5 million, if not more.
I was an immigrant, and she kind of grew up in LA, not the best circumstances. So, feel blessed that we kind of got in a situation where we can, now put generational wealth in our family and set up our kids to have the advantages that we didn't have. Kind of the American dream.
So that's one example. And then another example is this one is kind of special because it hits really close to home, as you'll hear. This is from late last year. There was this kind of surprise announcement from the Trump administration. I think it was over a weekend that the administration was going to try to charge $100,000 fee on people who were applying for H-1B visas. And so I'll just play this. This was like the top of the show with me and my co-host Darian Woods.
I'm Wailin Wong, and I'm joined by Darian Woods, freshly back from his honeymoon. Congratulations.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you.
How was your trip?
It was mixed.
Ah.
So, most notably, I was on the beach with my now wife, and she gets a text message from her boss, and it's saying, "Are you in the country?"
Oh my
And we're
gosh.
like, "What? What happened?" And so we look at the news, and Donald Trump has announced that there is this new huge $100,000 fee for new entrants into the country for people with H-1B visas. And my wife is on an H-1B visa.
Oh my gosh. This was such a huge news story last week, and you were living it.
I could not escape the news. It was very frustrating, just as you're trying to unwind. And so we take this very panicked, tearful trip to the Barcelona airport, and we're reconsidering, what country do we live in? It's really stressful. And we missed the last flight out of Barcelona to the US before the deadline.
Oh my gosh.
And so we're just thinking, what do we do now?
All right, so that was, I mean, that's not something we planned for, but it just so happened that, our co-host Darian was and his new wife was caught up in all of this. So, I think putting a face to a story, it's such kind of a simple thing, but it is something we try to do with almost every story. And even if it's, we interview an economist or a researcher, we try to kind of make them into human beings too, and not just talking heads. That's another way to make things personal. And so we're like, were you surprised by anything? Or we try to just make them seem like fully fleshed out human beings, even if they're kind of just sharing, the results of, not just sharing, not to diminish the research, but even if they're really there as the expert voice, we try to kind of make them sound lively and kind of fun and like a personality beyond their research. So far we've covered find an economic principle behind the news and make it personal. The third kind of guiding principle I want to talk about is optimize for delight. And I think this is actually really important. And I have this coworker who once described the Planet Money ethos as one fact and then jazz hands, which is not true. Maybe sometimes it's they turn the jazz hands dial up too much and then we feel like there's not enough learning. But I think that often with an economic topic, it's if someone retains just kind of one interesting fact or one piece of learning that they can maybe share at a cocktail party or say hey, I understand this a little bit better the next time we see it in the news, that's a huge win. Our episodes can be quite information dense. So if someone just retains one piece of information, but they associate it with maybe a fun moment or something, I think that's a win. And I think you have to make this stuff fun. Otherwise, it's just going to go over like a lead balloon. You have to make it fun. And I always like to say that I take my job really seriously. I do not take myself very seriously. We have a lot of fun on the team. And obviously, with everything that's going on in the news, it's not totally appropriate to have fun all the time, but when we can, we try to lean into the fun. And so, one example, this comes from the Planet Money book, is we did a section about public goods and we explain what public goods are. And then we do a tour of interesting public goods from around the world. So this might be actually optimizing for like disgustingness and not fun. I find it really fun. But there is this worm wall. I don't know if you've heard of this, between Colombia and Panama. So there's this like disgusting parasite named a flesh-eating screwworm that affects livestock. The US eradicated it some 50 years ago. And the reason we were able to pull off this incredible feat of public health is because we manufacture sterile flies that would otherwise produce screwworms. And every week we drop millions of flies, sterilized screwworm flies, from planes in Panama, between Panama and Colombia. And then they mate with the screwworms and then with the flies that are already on the ground, and then they do not produce any screwworm babies. So this is like, I don't know who came up with this. It's disgusting, but it really works. It's worked great. The screwworm has only recently come back into the US, but it is thanks to this great worm wall that we have mostly eradicated the screwworm. So we kind of took that concept of like, what are some interesting public goods people might not know about? We turned them into these like vintage style postcards. So I think this is like one way you can have fun with otherwise what's like kind of a dry concept, like explaining a public good. And then the second example is we did an episode a few years ago about hedonic adjustment, which is this idea of kind of adjusting for kind of pleasure in CPI. And I will play this and let you see what we did.
Lately, we've been wondering if the CPI shows changes in the price of stuff we buy, how does it account for the fact that the stuff we buy also changes over time? For example, how can you possibly compare the price of like a brick phone from the 90s with the latest smartphone?
It turns out economists have a trick for this, and it's called hedonic adjustment. So hedonic comes from the Greek word for pleasure. So today on the show...
Did someone say pleasure?
Oh, who are you?
I'm Hedone, daughter of Eros and Psyche.
OMG! I think I learned about you in school.
Oh, then you know that I am the goddess of pleasure, enjoyment, delight.
Wow. Are you going to help us, like, explain how economists account for pleasure in inflation?
No, that sounds boring.
Okay, so that was just like a silly little radio play that we put together, and we had a producer come and like act out the part of Hedone. And I know it's like quite silly. It's a little bit like, sometimes I think the energy we bring is like, we got to put on a talent show to save the town theater. But I think it honestly works for us, and it's very useful in explaining economics, because sometimes you just have to kind of go for it and do something a little silly, but it helps the information stick. And I think we have fun along the way, and very few other economics programs do this. So I think, to recap, these are the three guiding principles we use at the show. Find the economic system or principle at work, make it personal, optimize for delight. And the final example I'll play for you before I take your questions is kind of a small example that I think actually embodies all three of these principles, which we try to do with every episode. Sometimes it's not always possible, but this is an episode we did a few years ago where we actually got to ride along with the Bureau of Labor Statistics as they put together the jobs numbers, the monthly jobs report. And we were able to sit with a contractor as she called around to employers around the country to ask them, like, how many people have you hired, et cetera. And then that kind of helps explain how the jobs report is put together. It puts a human face to it, and it's like a delightful piece of tape, in my opinion. So I will play this.
It's Erica with the U.S. Department of Labor. How are you doing today?
Doing good. I think I just know your voice by now when you call.
I know. It's been a while for us.
The way the survey works is that the same business will get a call each month for anywhere between 2 and 4 years. That way, they're already familiar with how the survey works when Erica dials them.
And so for that pay period that included May 12th, then how many total employees worked to receive pay?
80.
80. Went up another person. Yay. We'll take it.
It doesn't happen very often lately, so we'll take it.
No, I know.
So that was my final example, and I just like how it puts such a personal touch on something as kind of abstract seeming as the monthly jobs report. And we love covering the jobs report. We call it Jobs Friday, so it's a big kind of tentpole kind of episode for us. And so I hope that gives you kind of a little peek into how we approach storytelling at The Indicator. And now I'm very happy to take your questions.
Well, Waylon, I'm confident I'm speaking on our whole audience today, thanking you for being here. We're really excited to have you join us at this event. We do have some questions from some educators in the chat, so I'm going to relay some of those to you. So one was about what part of your job is the most fun? What element of business communication do you find so enjoyable that it motivates you to keep at it?
I think the most fun part about my job is that whatever I'm curious about, I have this professional license to pick up the phone or open up an email and just find the person who can explain it to me, and then I get to go talk to them. And that's actually what got me into journalism in the first place, like all the way back in high school, like realizing that it is just a professional excuse to be either nosy or to get the answer to something you're curious about. And I'm curious about like a great many things, and I think our audience is too. So I love that. Yeah, it's just like this passport to go anywhere.
I love that, like curiosity as the driver of behind your work and satisfying that. Yes, I think we'd all love to instill that sense of curiosity in our students too. And some of the content from the indicator can help us certainly do that.
Thank you.
Another one of our educators was wondering how much the cut to public funding for public media affected the indicator. For example, might there be fewer opportunities for you to go on location for some of these interesting stories?
Yeah, that's a good question. The federal funding cuts, big NPR was like a little bit more insulated from it than some of our local member stations, who rely more on that source of funding. That being said, it was obviously a huge blow to the organization, and we did recently do cuts at NPR. No one on the podcast side of NPR was affected, including our team. So that was so we were lucky in that way. But I do think there is just general belt tightening, and I've been in media long enough to know that these cycles, like, they happen very regularly. And so we are probably in a cycle of, if not belt tightening, being more selective about, what does get funded. So yeah, field reporting is definitely a part of that, and so like Planet Money was recently, they were able to send like a team to Brazil to do some reporting. I think that kind of big, kind of more resource intensive trips like that do get harder. But we try to take the opportunities when we can, especially if there's like a local opportunity for getting out in the field.
Yeah, absolutely. And educators certainly can identify with fluctuations in public funding for different things. We've all had to make adjustments over time. One of our educators with us today is curious about who, at the indicator, who all do you envision as your target audience?
Ooh, what a good question. I think we are envisioning people who are not necessarily economics nerds, but they're definitely curious, and they are people who are engaged with the news, and they see stuff that they want to know more about. And I think these are people who, just want to feel empowered to, like make choices about their own like economic and financial destinies. And I think that we give them the tools to do that by kind of explaining how all these systems work. We do kind of try to split the difference where, we want to appeal to the super nerds as well. But we don't want to leave anyone behind.
We appreciate that.
Yeah, and so, it is like a balance and act, right? And so sometimes that comes out in the editing process where we're even going like line by line, being like, okay, like, do we need to explain what a yield curve is? Like, what the yield curve is? Do we need to kind of explain that, bond yields move inversely to prices? Or do we think people understand that? Like, and we also never know when people are jumping in, right? We are getting new listeners all the time. And so you never know if an episode you're putting out there is like the first indicator episode someone's listened to or like the 300th, right? So it is a little bit like of a balancing act to kind of speak to everyone at once. But I think we just kind of like follow kind of our guiding principles around like these are smart, curious people who want to know a little bit more.
Yeah, so the audience today are classroom educators, and so we are tasked with really selling econ to our students. Like we've bought in, right? But we need to bring them along with us. And so you've explained a little bit how you all do that at the indicator, like optimizing for delight. But specifically for young people, like teenagers, how might you explain to a teenager, like if you were making a pitch to a teenager about why economics matters, why it's something they should be excited about or care about, what kinds of things might you say so that we can then borrow those and use those with our students?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I would say is that like everyone is an expert on their own personal economy. And I think everyone, especially like if you're talking about high school students who kind of like been out in the world a little bit longer, and some of them might have like part-time jobs, they might have their own money, and they are thinking, they're old enough to be thinking ahead towards like what's after high school, whether it's college or just going out in the workforce or trade school or careers, whatever. And so I think you can appeal to them by saying, like, you have a sense of like how much money you think you need or how much money you think you want to kind of have the life you want. And, you also have a sense of like, is this fair? Like, does the system that you're entering, does it feel fair? I think that like younger generations now have a much more sharp sense of that than like me when I was growing up, and I just kind of was like, I don't know. I just felt more complacent when I was growing up. And I feel like even I have a 13-year-old, I feel like she is like much more aware of like what feels fair and like who has resources and who doesn't. And I think you can lean into that and be like, okay, what about the system feels unfair to you? If you feel like you're not going to be able to get a job, or you're not going to be able to like afford a house, or you don't understand how this influencer is making millions of dollars, like economics can help explain some of that. And when you draw the curtain back and you see all like the cogs, you see how the system works, I think that empowers people to make choices about like what you want to do, how you want to maybe change the system if you find it unfair or if there's stuff you don't like about it. So I think that's one way to do it. And I think, kids who are like about to enter the world as like more fully formed adults, I think they're all very interested in like how to make money.
Yeah.
And I think you can appeal to that. I think you can kind of appeal to that instinct as well and be like, okay, well, we'll talk about it. And we're going to talk about like, is it smart to put your money in the stock market? What should you be investing in? I think this is stuff that's like inherently interesting to kids.
Yeah, I love that. So like you said, they're inherently interested to learn about that. And we do a lot of talking about how economic principles apply everywhere. So if money, like earning income is the hook that we can use to bring them in and show them how really this is all economic principles, that's ideal. One of our attendees is asking about if you can identify an episode where there was a particularly unusual response from listeners, or an episode that brought in sort of a new group of listeners that maybe you hadn't thought about before. So it's sort of an unusual response to an episode, or an episode that resonated with an audience, or brought you audience members you didn't already have.
Yeah, so we've done a few special series where we'll devote a whole week to a topic, and then like every episode that week will be around a topic. And a few years ago, one of our producers pitched a series about the influencer economy. And this is not something that we had studied, that we had done a lot of, coverage of before, but we did, 5 episodes about influencers, how they make their money, like how they get paid, like how much do they get paid. And I think that one that series we got a really nice response to. And it also helped bring in, I think, younger listeners, because that is kind of I think, a perpetual challenge for public media. Is we do skew a little bit older in our audience, even on the podcast side. Podcasts skew younger than the radio side, but even I think when you look out broadly at kind of media consumption, young people are not necessarily flocking to NPR, even on the podcast side. So I think like hooking into economic themes that are more appealing to young people kind of brought in hopefully some younger listeners that stuck around and checked out what else we had to offer. And I think it also connected us to kind of people who are just out in the industry doing interesting things, who are on the younger end. They, they weren't like, we weren't interviewing like PhD economists for that story. We were talking to just, influencers, content creators who are making a living doing it or trying to. And I think that was a lot of fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard, I mean, some of our staff has spent some time in high school classrooms very recently, and our audience is in classrooms all the time, can attest to the fact that students are interested in being influencers or understanding how that works. So I can see how that would attract their interest. Um, Many of us here did not plan on teaching economics. It's the rare case where someone is teaching economics at the high school level, at least, where like that was their plan. They often get sort of voluntold that they're teaching econ, and many of us come to love it, right? We didn't know we would love it, but we arrive at that. So we each kind of have our own unique path to economics as something we care about and we're interested in. So I'm curious what you said you were studying journalism. So that was your path. Like how did economics become a passion for you?
Yeah, I think for me, it was just kind of by having some really formative internships early on, because I always thought that I was going to be a metro reporter. I grew up in the Chicago suburbs, and my big dream was to just land at the Chicago Tribune, my hometown paper, and covering like City Hall. I thought that was going to be what I was going to do. And then I ended up having one internship at the Orange County Register, which is out in California, and they had me rotate around to all the different desks. And I spent like a week or two on the business desk, and I never covered business in my whole life. But they assigned me a bunch of stories that were super interesting. Like they assigned me a story about the kind of commercialization of Cinco de Mayo as a holiday, and whether this actually Cinco de Mayo means anything to kind of the local Mexican and American population, or whether it was just like purely kind of like a craven corporate cash grab. And so they like sent me out to like a Mexican grocery store to talk to shoppers about whether they were like shopping to commemorate Cinco de Mayo. So like that was really fun. And then I ended up doing an internship at Dow Jones Newswires in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And that was like a wild time because it was 2003. The country was just starting to crawl out of a massive economic crisis. And it was like the whole economy was broken. It was like beyond broken. And so I learned so much about how an economy is supposed to work by, covering an economy that was like trying to sputter back to life. And so, I mean, that was just like a fascinating time to be living there, and to be covering economics. So it was really just kind of by immersing myself in kind of these different environments that I really grew to love it.
Yeah, I love that. Like you didn't know like it wasn't something you were initially drawn to, but then having a good experience and like being really fascinated by an element changed that. Because a lot of us, for example, had principles of econ in college and was like, this is terrible. But then when we encountered, some simulations or really fun lessons that you can do with students where you bring it to life, that really changes your thinking about it.
Absolutely.
We have time for another question or two. One, so I know the indicator and Planet Money aren't the same thing, but they're connected.
Yeah.
So two big projects, from Planet Money of late is the book, of course, which Econiful members will be receiving as part of today's event, but also the creating the board game. Can you tell us about, to the degree that you were connected to those projects, maybe which of those was more compelling to you or enjoyable for you as a team member?
Yeah, I mean, I was a little bit more involved in the book side, I would say, by a nose. And that was great fun to be involved with the book because we all got to kind of weigh in on like the cover design and like all this different stuff kind of during the process. And I think what's really fun about those projects is that like the whole Planet Money ethos is like if they're curious about something, sometimes they just like go all out and they'll just like do a project to kind of learn about all the steps of something. And it's really I don't take for granted that I work at a media outlet that has the resources to do that kind of thing, right? So even looking at like past projects that I wasn't part of, like Planet Money buying a barrel of oil and tracing it, or like making a t-shirt, like these are all like pretty like bonkers, like large scale projects. The book project was fun because it was like the culmination of like so much teamwork, um and so you got to see like so many people's episodes and reporting like go into this like beautiful project, and then we were able to do these live shows. So I did a live show in Chicago and I did one in Toronto. And that was wonderful because I got to meet so many Planet Money fans, and that was just amazing. The board game has also been fun. I've been a little less involved in that, but we did get to like play test some stuff along the way. And I think like the game is going to be out like imminently if it's not already out. And so that's just like really cool to like work on something that then, I might just like see at Target. And I think that's really neat. And then you kind of like sneak in the learning in there too, because the game is based on this like seminal economic research paper about asymmetric information. Sounds so exciting. But we turned it into a board game, and we worked with some like really cool people at Exploding Kittens to do it. And so I think that like it's such like a perfect blend of like fun, but also you like sneak in the vegetables in there. People sometimes don't even know.
Yeah, I remember an episode where you all, again, I don't remember if it was the Indicator or Planet Money, where they bought junk bonds. Like
Yeah.
we can live vicariously through you. And like the board game one, heads up, audience members, you can anticipate a workshop from us around that game. And I'm sure we'll be giving away copies of that game to folks. But listening to that, we create games as some of our part of our lessons. And so a deeper dive on like what makes a game work and what doesn't work was inspiring to us in terms of when we write games for lessons, like how can we, we're not exploding kittens, but how can we take some of those lessons and make classroom games that function really well. So I don't think we have any other questions in the chat. We are so grateful that you joined us today, and I hope if any of our attendees today don't currently listen to the indicator, that maybe this has inspired you to see what's on offer. And we will shortly be having a breakout room for those of you who want to chat about how you have used the indicator or share ideas about how you could use the indicator in your classroom. You can share those ideas. So Wailin, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate your time, and I know our audience members are excited to get the book and to think about how they can use that with students as well.
Oh, thank you so much. I had a great time, and feel free to reach out at any time. I think my email was on that last slide, and the organizers have it. So anything you're curious about, if you have like questions that come up in class that you want us to tackle on the show,